Did you know that psychology is one of the youngest sciences, but its questions are some of the oldest? Philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle were pondering in the mind over 2,000 years ago, but psychology didn't officially become its own science until 1879, when William Wundt opened the first psychology lab in Germany. In other words, humans have always wanted to understand why we think, feel, and act the way we do, but only recently decided to study it scientifically. You're on the couch with Dr. Ty. Psychology is an exciting field, and the history of psychology offers the opportunity to make sense of how it has grown and how it has developed. The history of psychology also provides certain perspectives. Rather than a dry collection of names and dates, the history of psychology tells us about the important intersection of time and place and that defines who we are. Consider what happens when you meet someone for the first time. The conversation usually begins with a series of questions such as: where'd you grow up? How long have you lived here? Where did you go to school? The importance of history in defining who we are cannot be overstated. Whether you are seeing a physician, maybe talking with a counselor, or even applying for a job, everything begins with history. The same is true for studying the history of psychology. Getting a history of the field helps to make sense of where we are and how we got there. Precursors to American psychology can be found in philosophy as well as physiology. Philosophers such as John Locke and Thomas Reid, they promoted empiricism. And this was the idea that all knowledge comes from experience. The work of Locke and Reid and others emphasize the role of human observers and the primacy of the senses in defining how the mind comes to acquire knowledge. In American colleges, the universities in the early 1800s, these principles were taught as courses on mental and moral philosophy. Most often, these courses taught about the mind based on faculties of intellect, will, as well as the senses. Philosophical questions about the nature of mind and knowledge were matched in the 19th century by philosophical investigations of the sensory system of the human observer. German physiologist Hermann von Helmholtz measured the speed of the neural impulse and explored the physiology of hearing as well as vision. His work indicated that our senses can be decisive as well as a mirror of the external world in which we live in. Such work showed that even though the human senses were fallible, the mind could be measured using the methods of science. In all, it suggested that a science of psychology was actually feasible. An important implication of Helmholtz's work was that there is a psychological reality and a physical reality, and that the two are not identical. This was not a new idea. Philosophers like Locke and his colleagues written extensively on this particular topic. And in the 19th century, philosophical speculation about the nature of mind became subject to the rigors of science. This gave rise to the question of the relationship between the mental, the experiences of the senses, and the material, the external reality, were investigated by a number of German researchers, including Ernest Weber and Gustav Fechner. Their work was called psychophysics, and it introduced methods for measuring the relationship between physical stimuli and human perception that would serve as the basis for a new science of psychology. The formal development of modern psychology is usually credited to the work of German physician and physiologist Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt helped us to establish the field in experimental psychology by serving as a strong promoter of the idea that psychology could be an experimental field and by providing classes, textbooks, and a laboratory for training students. In 1875, Wundt joined the faculty at the University of Leipzig and quickly became the individual that made plans for creation of a program of experimental psychology. In 1879, he complemented his lectures on experimental psychology with a laboratory experience. This was an event that has served as the popular date for the establishment of the science of psychology. The response to the new science was immediate and global. William Wundt attracted students from all around the world to study the new experimental psychology and to have the opportunity to work in his fabulous lab. Students were trained to offer detailed self reports of their reactions to various stimuli and procedures known as introspection. The goal was to identify the elements of consciousness in addition to the study of sensation and perception. Research was done on mental chronometry, more commonly known as reaction time. The work of William Wundt and his students demonstrated that the mind could be measured and the nature of consciousness could be revealed through scientific means. It was an exciting proposition and one that found great interest in America. After the opening of Wundt's lab in 1879, it took just 4 years for the first psychology laboratory to open up in the United States of America. William Wundt's version of psychology arrived in America most visibly through the work by Edward Bradford Titchener. He was a student of Wundt's work. Titchener brought to America a brand of experimental psychology that was referred to as structuralism. Structuralists were interested in the contents of the mind, what the mind is. For Titchener, the general adult mind was the proper focus for a new psychology, and he excluded from studying those with mental deficiencies, children, and animals. Experimental psychology spread rather rapidly through North America, and by the 1900s, there were more than 40 laboratories in the United States as well as Canada. Psychology in America also organized early with the establishment of the American Psychological Association, also known as the APA, in the year 1892. Titchener felt that this new organization did not adequately represent the interest of experimental psychology, so in 1904 he recognized or organized a group of colleagues to create what is known as the Society of Experimental Psychologists. The group met annually to discuss research in experimental psychology. Reflecting the times, women researchers were not invited, nor were they even welcomed. It is interesting to note that Titchener's first doctoral student was actually a woman. Her name was Margaret Floy Washburn. And despite a number of barriers, in 1894, Washburn became the first woman in America to earn a PhD in psychology, and in 1921, only the second woman to be elected president of the American Psychological Association. Striking a balance between the science and the practice of psychology continues to this day. In 1988, the American Psychological Society, known now as the Association for Psychological Science, was founded with the central mission of advancing psychological science. While Titchener and his followers adhered to a structural psychology, others in America were pursuing different approaches. William James, G. Stanley Hall, and James McKean Cattell were among a group that became identified as functionalisms or functionalists. Influenced by Darwin's evolutionary theory, functionalists were interested in the activities of the mind, what the mind does. An interest in functionalism opened the way for the study of a wide range of approaches, including animal and comparative psychology. William James is regarded as writing perhaps the most influential, important book in the field of psychology, Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. Opposed to the reductionist ideas of Titchener, James proposed that consciousness is ongoing and continuous. It cannot be isolated and reduced to elements. And for James, consciousness helps us to adapt the environment in such ways as allowing us to make choices and have personal responsibility over those choices. At Harvard, James occupied a position of authority and respect in psychology and philosophy. Through his teaching and writing, he influenced psychology for generations to come. One of his students, Mary Whiton Calkins, faced many of the challenges that confronted Margaret Floyd Washburn and other women interested in pursuing graduate education in psychology. With much persistence, Calkins was able to study with James at Harvard. She eventually completed all the requirements for the doctoral degree, but Harvard actually refused to grant her that diploma because she was a woman. Despite all these challenges, Calkins went on to become an accomplished researcher and the first woman elected president of the American Psychological Association in the year 1905. G. Stanley Hall made substantial and lasting contributions to the establishment of psychology in the United States. At Johns Hopkins University, he founded the first psychological laboratory in America in 1883. And then in 1887, he created the first journal of psychology in America, the American Journal of Psychology. In the year 1892, he founded the American Psychological Association. And in 1909, he invited a host, Freud, at Clark University. This was the only time, by the way, that Sigmund Freud visited America. Influenced by the evolutionary theory, Hall was interested in the processes of adaptation and human development. Using surveys and questionnaires to study children, Hall wrote extensively on child development and education. While a graduate in education in psychology was restricted for women in Hall's time, it was all but non existent for African Americans. In another first, Hall mentored Francis Cecil Sumner, who in 1920 became the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology in America. James McKeen Cattell received his PhD with Wundt, but quickly turned his interest to the assessment of individual differences. Influenced by the work of Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, Cattell believed that mental abilities such as intelligence were inherited and could be measured using mental tests. Like Galton, he believed society was better served by identifying those with superior intelligence and supported efforts to encourage them to reproduce. Such beliefs were associated with eugenics, and this was the promotion of selective breeding, and fueled an early debate about the contributions of heredity and environment in defining who we are. At Columbia University, Cattell developed a department of psychology that became world famous, also promoting psychological science through advocacy and as a publisher of scientific journals and reference works. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, psychology continued to grow and flourish in America. It was large enough to accommodate varying points of view on the nature of mind and behavior. Gestalt psychology is a great example of this. The Gestalt movement began in Germany with the work of Max Wertheimer. Opposed to the reductionist approach of Wundt's laboratory psychology, Wertheimer and his colleagues Kurt Kafka, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Lewin believed that studying the whole of any experience was richer than studying individual aspects of that experience. The saying, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is a Gestalt perspective. Consider that a melody is an additional element beyond the collection of notes that are comprised in it. The Gestalt psychologists propose that the mind often processes information simultaneously rather than sequentially. For instance, when you look at a photograph, you see a whole image, not just a collection of pixels or colors. Using Gestalt principles, Wertheimer and his colleagues also explored the nature of learning and thinking. Most of the German Gestalt psychologists were Jewish and were forced to flee the Nazi regime due to the threats posed on both academic and personal freedoms. In America, they were able to introduce a new audience to the Gestalt perspective, demonstrating how it could be applied to perception and learning. In many ways, the work of the Gestalt psychologists served as sort of a precursor to the rise of cognitive psychology in America. Behaviorism emerged early in the 20th century and became a major force in American psychology. Championed by psychologists such as John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, behaviorism rejected any reference to mind and viewed overt and observable behaviors such as proper subject matter of psychology. Through the scientific study of behavior, it was hoped that the laws of learning could be derived that would probably promote and make predictions and control behavior. Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov influenced early behaviorism in America. Pavlov's work on conditioned learning, popularly referred to as classical condition, provided support for the notion that learning and behavior were controlled by events in the environment and could be explained with no reference to mind or consciousness. For a number of decades, behaviorism dominated American psychology, and by the 1960s, psychologists began to recognize that behaviorism was unable to fully explain human behavior because it neglected mental processes. The turn toward a cognitive psychology was not new. In the 1930s, British psychologist Frederick C. Bartlett explored the idea of the constructive mind, recognizing that people use their past experiences to construct frameworks in which to understand new experiences. Some of the major pioneers in American cognitive psychology article Jerome Bruner, Roger Brown, and George Miller. In the 1950s, Bruner conducted pioneering studies on cognitive aspects of sensation and perception. Brown concluded original research on language and memory, coined the flashbulb memory, and figured out how to study the tip of the tongue phenomenon. Miller's research on working memory is legendary. In 1956, his paper, The Magic Number 7, plus or minus 2, Some Limits on Our Capacity Processing. Information is one of the most highly cited papers in psychology. A popular interpretation of Miller's research was that the number of bits of information an average human can hold in working memory is about 7 plus or minus 2. Around the same time, the study of computer science was growing, and it was used as an analogy to explore the understanding of how the mind actually works. The work of Miller and others in the 1950s and 1960s has inspired tremendous interest in cognition as well as neuroscience, both of which dominate much of the contemporary American psychology today. In America, there has always been an interest in the application of psychology to everyday life. Mental testing is an important example. Modern intelligence tests were developed by French psychologist Alfred Binet. His goal was to develop a test that would identify school children in need of educational support. His tests, which include tasks of reasoning and problem solving, was introduced to the United States by Henry Goddard and later standardized by Louis Terman. This was at Stanford University. The assessment and the meaning of intelligence was a fuel debate in American psychology and society for about 100 years. Much of this was captured in a nature by nature debate that raises questions about the relative contributions of heredity and the environment in determining intelligence. Applied psychology was not limited to mental testing. What psychologists were learning in their laboratories was applied in many settings, including military, business, industry, as well as education. In the early 20th century was witness to rapid advances in applied psychology. Hugo Munsterberg of Harvard University made contributions to such areas as employee selection, eyewitness testimony, and psychotherapy. Walter D. Scott and Harry Hollingworth produced original work on the psychology of advertising as well as marketing. Lillian Gilbreth was a pioneer in the industry of psychology and engineering psychology. Working with her husband Frank, they promoted the use of time and motion studies to improve efficiency in industry. Lillian also brought an efficiency movement to the home, designing kitchens and appliances, including the pop-up trash can and the refrigerator door shelving. Their psychology was If there's a psychology of efficiency was also found plenty of applications at home with their 12 children. The experience served as the inspiration for the movie Cheaper by the Dozen. Clinical psychology was also an early application of experimental psychology in America. Leitner Whitmer received his PhD in experimental psychology with William Wundt and returned to the University of Pennsylvania, where he opened a psychological clinic in 1896. Whitmer believed that because psychology dealt with the study of sensation and perception, it should be of value in treating children with learning and behavioral problems. He is credited as the founder of both clinical and a school of psychology. As the roles of psychologists and the needs of the public continue to change, it was necessary for psychology to begin to define itself as a profession. Without standards for the training and the practice, anyone could use the title psychologist and offer services to the public. As early as about 1917, applied psychologists organized to create standards for education, training, and licensure. By the 1930s, these efforts led to the creation of the American Association for Applied Psychology. While the American Psychological Association represented the interests of academic psychologists, served those in education, industry, and consulting, as well as clinical work. The advent of WW2 or World War II changed everything. The psychiatrist casualties of war were staggering, and there were simply not enough mental health professionals to meet the need. Recognizing the shortage, the federal government urged that the AAP and the APA work together to meet the mental health needs of the nation. The result was the merging of the AAP and the APA and a focus on training of these professionals to become psychologists. Through the provisions of the National Mental Health Act of 1946, funding was made available that allowed the APA, the Veterans Administration, as well as the Public Health Service to work together to develop training programs that would produce clinical psychologists. These efforts led to the converging of the Boulder Conference and Graduate Education Clinical Psychology in Boulder in 1949. The meeting launched doctoral training in psychology and gave us scientist practitioner model of training. Similar meeting also helped launch doctoral training programs in counseling and school psychology as well. Throughout the second half of the 20th century, alternative to Boulder have been made and debated. In 1973, the Vail Conference on Professional Training in Psychology proposed the Scholar Practitioner model and the PsyD degree, or Doctor of Psychology. It is a training model that emphasizes clinical training and practice that has become more common today. Given that psychology deals with the human condition, it is not surprising that psychologists would be involving themselves in social issues as well. For more than a century, psychology and psychologists have been agents of social action and change. Using the methods and the tools of science, psychologists have challenged assumptions, stereotypes, and stigma. Founded in 1936, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues has supported research and action on a wide range of social issues. Individually, there have been more psychologists whose efforts have promoted social change. Helen Thompson Woolley and Letta S. Hollingsworth were pioneers in research on the psychology of sex differences. Working in the early 20th century, when women's rights were marginalized, Thompson examined the assumptions that women were over-emotional compared to men and found that emotion did not influence women's decisions any more than it did men's. Hollingsworth found that the menstruation did not negatively impact women's cognitive or motor abilities either. Such work combated harmful stereotypes and showed that psychological research could contribute to social change. Among the first generation of African American psychologists, Mamie Phipps and her husband, Kenneth Clark, studied the psychology of race and demonstrated the ways in which the school segregation negatively impacted the self-esteem of African American children. Their research was influential in 1954 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended school segregation. In psychology, greater advocacy for these issues and started to impact the African American community and were advanced by the creation of the Association of Black Psychologists. In 1957, psychologist Evelyn Hooker published the paper, The Adjustment of the Male Overt Homosexual, reporting on her research that showed no significant differences in the psychological adjustment between homosexual and heterosexual men. Her research helped to depathologize homosexuality and contributed to the decision by the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the year 1973. Growth as well as expansion have been a constant influence in American psychology. In the latter part of the 20th century, areas such as social, developmental, as well as personality psychology have made major contributions to our understanding what it is meant to be human. Today, neuroscience is enjoying tremendous growth and is continuing to be booming. As I mentioned a little bit earlier in this, it is a challenge to cover all the history of psychology in such a small period of time. Errors of omission and commission are likely in such a selective review. The history of psychology helps us to set a stage upon which the story of psychology can be told. This brief introduction is just trying to provide you with a glimpse into the depth and rich content that's offered by the history of psychology. And just like planting a tree, you must start with the roots, and the roots grow into be something fabulous that goes on and on and on even after we're gone. I'm hoping that this introduction to psychology and the history of it helps you understand the importance of the roots, so you can maybe understand a little bit more about what we'll be talking about throughout this series on the couch with Dr. Ty. As always, stay safe and stay smart.